Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I hope you're having a great Shabbat. I hope that you've been able to relax and spend time with your families and spend time, most importantly, with God. Um, so today we are going to go through Parashah 2. It is entitled Noach, or in English, Noah. Um, as you can probably see, it goes through the account of Noah, through all the familiar things like the flood and um, different things of that nature. Uh, And so we are going to explore and deep dive into this parashah and see what God has to say to us. Um, God always has things to say to us through His Word, and so I encourage you when you read the Word, not just to read like a novel, but to really dig into it and see what is God trying to say overall, and then also what is God trying to say to you. What He says to one other person may be totally different from what He has to say to you. So I encourage you to really open yourself up to what God wants to speak to you. All right, so let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so we left off last parashah at the end of chapter 5 and going into chapter 6. In the first parashah, Bereshit, they went through the days of creation. They went through, the Bible went through the account of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and went through some genealogy. And so now we are picking up with Noach. Okay, so who was Noah? What was he like? So obviously he was a man. He was a person just like you and me. He had his pluses and his minuses. He had his great things and his faults. He was not perfect. But one thing they point out in the narrative, it says that he walked with God continually. Now, if you think through the rest of the Tanakh or the Old Testament, you'll see where there are several people, David, Moshe, different people who actually walk with God continually. That it wasn't that they were perfect. It wasn't that they had everything all together, but the point of it was they walked with God continually. They maintained a close relationship with Him. Their heart was after Him, and that in our fallen condition, that is what God is looking for. He's looking for people who are willing to walk with Him, despite their failures, despite everything else, willing to walk with Him and draw close to Him, and things of that nature. So that's the kind of person Noah was. He was a person that God could count on, a person that God could work with. Okay. So as we read further along in the narrative, we read that God says the earth was ruined before Him. Okay. Now, when we think of things that are ruined, we think of maybe someone messed up a garment. It was stained or something. Or someone messed up a drawing and now it's ruined. Or someone crashed their car and now it's ruined. Okay? But it goes a little bit deeper than that with how he meant by ruined. So in the Hebrew, that word ruined really speaks of intentional acts of destruction. Okay, it wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just happenstance or whatever that kind of deal, but it was actually intentional, malicious acts of destruction. So what that connotes there is that all flesh, especially humanity, had destroyed the earth. It was in destruction. It was absolutely ruined. Okay, all the beautiful creation God made laid in ruins before Him. Now you can imagine how we'd feel as humans if we watched everything we had created be totally destroyed. We'd have all kind of emotions. We'd be angry. We'd be sad. We'd be heartbroken. And there's just a few emotions we'd feel if we had what we created destroyed. You can imagine how much more amplified that would be with God looking at everything, all the beauty He created, and it would be just marred. Okay, and part of how that happened was because the earth was filled with violence toward everything. Okay, so and to go further, all flesh, not just some flesh, all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Okay, so God created everything to have its own way. Okay, it programmed, however you want to look at it. We all had our own way of doing things, our own way of supposed to act and respond, our own instincts, our own patterns. Okay, and according to the Bible text, all flesh had corrupted that way. In other words, they were not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Everything was all messed up, and it was filled with violence. Um, Excuse me, my child was being a little loud. Um, it was filled with violence toward everything. So you can imagine there was just people running around, killing each other, hurting creation, tearing down plants and trees, killing animals for no reason at all, just for sport. I mean, just anything you can possibly imagine as being violent towards his creation. That was what was going on. Okay, so it's absolute chaos and just absolutely horrible. Okay, again, you can just imagine God looking at this and saying, you know, just totally heartbroken and angry at the same time. Okay, so going through verses 13 through 22, God starts preparing Noach to build the ark because according to what God says in that chapter, the end of all things has come before me. Okay, He is ready to start over. It is so bad that there is no redemption of anything except for Noach in a small subsection of animals and plants that are going to be brought on board with Noach aboard the ark. Okay, so again, the earth was filled with violence because of all flesh. All flesh had lost it their way. They were killing each other, destroying the earth. It was really bad. So God decided to start over again on land. Now, what's curious here is that nothing is mentioned about water. Okay, you hear about all the land animals, all the birds, and all humanity being killed off, right? But there is nothing said about the water. Why? Why not the water? Now, one obvious thing may be, well, he's going to bring a flood. So if a flood comes, obviously it's not going to kill the creatures in the water. That's very true. Okay, so obviously if the water, if it's the world's going to be cleansed by water, then obviously those in water are not going to be affected. Okay, um, but it leads to another thought. Were the waters and creatures in it not affected by sin? It's almost like it seems that all the creatures on land and air were affected by what happened with mankind, but somehow the creatures in the water and the waters themselves were not affected. Okay, now maybe they were in some way, but it seems like there was a definite separation here. And it kind of reminds me of creation, where God separated land from water. Okay, well that section He separated from the water is now bad and violent. Okay, but the waters themselves are still seen as good and are actually going to be used to cleanse the earth. So the creatures in it, I mean, were they fundamentally different? Were they just not capable of um, being corrupted or reacting the same way the ones on land did? Did man just have limited interaction with the creatures in the water, and so they weren't really affected that way? I know nowadays we talk about all the pollution and things like that man does on land and eventually ends up in the waters. But it doesn't hint that that's what happened here. So it almost hints where what happened in the water, that the waters were on a different kind of scale or level than everything on land, where they weren't really affected. It's just interesting to think about. All right, so let's go to the ark. So the ark had to be big. I mean, it had to be huge. You think about everything that Noah and his family had to bring into that ark. That had to be a really large vessel. We're talking probably like the size of of a freight liner or a cargo ship or things maybe even larger than that. I mean, just a massive vessel. As a matter of fact, it talks about in the word that they had 3 levels. And it was, again, quite large. So now, interesting enough, you think about if I had all these animals together in one place, you would start to have conflict. Now, that's us thinking along today's lines. In today's lines, you have predators, you have prey, you have carnivores, you have herbivores, you have all things like that. But during the time of Noah, at least in my opinion, I don't believe you had that. I believe that all the creatures still live together in harmony. Now, it does bring us back to the fact that all flesh has lost its way. Okay, so that leads us down another path. Did God supernaturally intervene to keep the animals at bay with each other to where they didn't harm each other? Was that harmony kind of created by God, or was it natural? If the earth was filled with violence because of all flesh, including all the creatures, then maybe it wasn't that the creatures lived together naturally in harmony. Maybe God created that harmony for the time period aboard the ark. We just don't know. So, this is also the time when God first mentions covenant. Now, if you remember back in the garden, God did kill an animal and provide and use its blood for a sin covering, and then also use the skins to actually cover up mankind. Okay. Now we're actually seeing the use of a word covenant. Okay. Now, so what is a covenant? So a lot of people, if we think of covenant, probably think of the word promise. Okay, if I promise something, that means that I'm going to do it. Now, if I break that promise, depending if it's legally binding or whatever, I may have repercussions. I may not. Now, obviously, God is not going to look favorably on that. You break your promise, it's the same as lying, right? But with a covenant, it's much stronger. Okay, with a covenant, it's always ratified by blood. Okay. Not only that, but it also signifies that whatever happens to the sacrifice being made for that covenant would happen to either party if they broke covenant. Okay. There's also stipulations in there about what one party's responsibility is and what the other party's responsibility is. So a covenant, it is a legally binding agreement, but it's much stronger. Okay, God's covenants cannot be broken. I'm gonna say it again. God's covenants cannot. Let me phrase it again. Let me rephrase it. Actually, God's covenants cannot be annulled. Okay, they're eternal. Every time God makes a covenant, it's eternal. Okay, so that means that even if we violate that covenant, we receive the repercussions from it, but the covenant itself stays intact. It stays in effect. Okay, and what's amazing about it is that God in His grace still performs His side of the covenant. Now, He will go ahead and enact punishment for the violation of that covenant, but at the same time, He will still perform His side of the covenant. Okay, so covenants are very, very important. You'll find covenants throughout the Bible, and they are the critical points of interaction with mankind by God. Okay, all right. So, along with all the animals and creatures that are supposed to come on board 2 by 2, God also commanded Noah and his family to gather all kind of food that was good for eating. Okay, so you can imagine probably food that for the animals and the creatures, food for themselves. But part of me also thinks that was also a way of preserving those plants and things of that nature, so that whenever they got off the ark, they could go ahead and replant things they could eat. Now, there were probably seeds that survived, I most definitely seeds that survived across the earth after the flood receded, and things were able to regrow. But I also think that God also gave them the way to actually have seeds ready with them to plant as soon as they got off the ark to go ahead and start growing food for themselves. All right. Another key phrase here is Noach did all that God had commanded him. Now that's important. We as humans are known for our partial obedience, whether it be mental, physical, verbal, whatever it happens to be. We tend to do things halfway. And if you read throughout the Bible, you'll see where God was not happy with those who went halfway with him. For instance, King Shaul or Saul, okay? He did not fully obey what God commanded him, and because of that, he ended up being rejected by God as king. Okay, so God takes very seriously that we do all that He commands us to do, not part of it, not the parts we like. We have no excuse to make, we have no way to make excuses for why we go halfway. For example, King Shaul tried to say, "Oh well, we did this to bring the best to you, and the people wanted this, and all this kind of stuff like that." But God didn't care about that. The point of the matter was God gave him a command, and he only partially fulfilled it. And partially fulfilling a command is the same as violating it. Okay? There is no halfway with commands with God. Either you obey it or you don't. You don't have a halfway point. If you do halfway, it's the same as you violating it. All right. Let's move on next. All right. So now we're actually getting to the flood narrative itself. Okay? So deliverance through the flood. This happens from chapter 7, verse 1 through chapter 8, verse 13. All right, so Noach was perceived as righteous in comparison to the rest of humanity. He was not perfect. In other words, so he was righteous. He walked with God as apart from all the rest of humanity. He was seen as righteous. Again, he was not perfect, but he stood out as someone who followed God and who could be counted on by God to do what God wanted, as opposed to the rest of humanity. So you can tell there must have been a really big gap between Noah's behavior and the behavior of the rest of humanity. And that reminded me, every generation has those who stand out above the rest. Now, what I mean by that is I don't mean, people who stand out because of their own ability. Okay, I'm not talking about the smartest or the strongest or the most debonair or whatever it happens to be. What I'm talking about is those who stand above the rest by following God with all their heart. Every generation has those who follow God with all their heart. Okay, they're the ones that stand above the rest in the eyes of God. Okay, and this is what God was talking about with Noach. Okay. Now, we also read here in this section that whereas 2 of every creature on earth was commanded to be taken originally, now God has actually asked him to take 7 of every clean animal, 2 of every unclean animal, and 7 of every clean animal. Okay, the 7 clean animals, those animals, it makes sense if Israel was going to have sacrifices every day, all the time. It makes sense that God would want to preserve more of the clean animals than he would of the unclean animals. Right? So that kind of explains that discrepancy between the 2 groups. All right? If you want to know why animals are considered clean versus unclean, you can read in the Torah, starting in the end of Exodus, going through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy to see what the stipulations were, what was considered a clean animal versus an unclean animal. Okay, so you're going to see the number 40 here. Okay, that's actually a number you see quite often in the Tanakh or in the Bible, or including in the Parashah or the New Testament. All right, I give some examples here. So it happened not just here with the flood, with the rains, but it also happened with Moshe on Mount Sinai, where he actually went up, I believe it was 3 times, and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. And then you also read about it in other areas in the Word. So 40 is a pretty important number, and that number symbolizes the change from one state to another. So it's a number, it's amount, it's an amount of days or amount of whatever measurement you want to think of. It's amount of that measurement to realize that change from one state to another. Okay, so here you have 40 days it took for it to rain and for the fountains of deep to open up until the walls were high enough to actually create the change that God wanted to create on the face of the earth. Okay, again, it mentions that Noach did all that God commanded him. Okay, so that's twice now where it's mentioned that Noach did all that God commanded him. That's important, again, because God requires complete obedience. Okay, now here's something interesting to think about. So we just read through all the different things that God wanted him to do. Now, get this: Noach only had 1 week to get everything done. 1 week. Um, Now that wasn't everything. That wasn't the with the ark. The ark, I think, had longer to get built. But as far as getting all the animals on, gathering all the food and that kind of deal, they had 1 week to get everything done. Okay, that's a pretty short period of time to get that done. So if God was the one bringing the animals and things to them, then that really helped, because then all he had to do was basically make sure, that the animals were accounted for, they got on board, they got where they needed to go, they got set up. But Noach and them did have to go out and actually, um, uh, harvest food to go ahead and bring in for them and for all those creatures. You can imagine what kind of job that was. So again, even if you cut some of that out, 1 week of time is really short period of time to get all of that done. Okay, so after that was done, um, the day after that 1 week was completed, it says the fountains of the deep were opened up and it rained heavily from the heavens. Okay, so if you remember back to Genesis, it talked about there was a mist that came up out of the ground that watered the face of the earth. Well, where did that mist come from? It wasn't raining, right? So it had to be coming from someplace. It came from the fountains of the deep. So below the ground, there were giant fountains of water. Okay, and remember also back in the creation narrative, it talked about um, uh, I talked about the separation of the waters of the oceans were separated from the land, and there was also water beneath. So you had the layer of earth separating the waters above, so to speak, from the waters below. Not just the sky, but now you have a difference between the oceans and then the waters beneath the earth. Okay, so now you see all this water being released. Okay, it is like, if you can imagine, these holes, this water shooting out of the ground violently, where it's just everywhere you can see there's water flying up out of the earth, and then you see the rain start coming down. So where that rain coming from? So there's a lot of different uh, theologians who looked at and believed that there was a kind of a hazy canopy in the sky. So the sky was like kind of moist. It wasn't clouds per se. There weren't clouds floating there, but it was more of like a mist, like a haze. Like, if you think about when you go out on a summer day and it's really, really humid and you can like kind of see a haze to the sky. It's kind of that only amplified, where you had enough moisture to where all of a sudden it condenses all and turns into rain. So it is pouring down rain from the sky. There is water shooting up from the earth. It must have been a scary sight to see. Um, and so as that's happening, that's starting to happen, um, Adonai, God, shuts them into the ark. They're all on board. They have everything they need. They're all good to go. And God himself shuts them in. I just thought that was kind of poignant. Noah didn't pull the door shut. He didn't send an angel to shut the door. God himself came down and shut the door for them and shut them in. And I just thought that was just such an act of loving care by him to actually intervene himself. He could have sent an angel. He could have done anything he wanted, but he himself went down and shut them in. He himself wanted to make sure that everything was good to go. This little ark, this little cradle on his side was carrying the remnant of everything that he created on land. And he wanted to make sure that it was shut, it was secure, and that they were all going to survive. Okay, so the rains and the release of the fountains took 40 days to fill the earth to about 22.5 feet above the highest mountains. Okay, again, that 40 represents a time to complete a change to a different state. Okay, so now we've completed the state it took to go ahead and wipe out the face of the earth. Okay, now it's all gone. The face of the earth is completely, everything is destroyed. Everything. Okay, and the only thing left on the earth is non-living. Okay, mountains, hills, things of that nature. The rest of the earth is bare. Okay. Okay. So again, only the land-based creatures died. Everything else in the water were all survived. And again, we kind of talked about the reasons why that might be, or thoughts about that. But again, the distinction was made between that was in the water and that was outside the water. It's almost like the separation that God made in the creation period. That land separation was actually what was judged, and the rest of the water was not. The water was seen as good. Okay, so you'll notice in the scriptures it says that all the creatures that had the spirit of life in them. Okay, now do not confuse that with them being living souls. Okay, there's a difference. You can have the spirit of life in you and not be eternal. Okay, all of us, all living things have the spirit of life in us, but not every being has a soul. We, as humans, have living souls. We are eternal. The rest of creation is not. I know a lot of people don't like to hear that. We don't like to think about that. Our dogs and our cats, when they're gone, that's it. But that is the reality of it. When those things die that do not have eternal souls die, they're dead, and that's it. And I know that's kind of really a depressing thought, but it's a reality. Okay. So their waters remained at their highest for 150 days. So they didn't start receding right away. They stayed that way for 150 days. All right. Now there's probably significance to that number 150. And if you all want to go ahead and look that up and see the significance, please feel free to. I tried looking. I couldn't find anything definitive. I found some conjecture on it, but I really didn't find it authoritative enough to include in our teaching today. Okay, so next it says God remembered. Well, that's weird. It kind of takes us back to the narrative with Adam and Eve, right? God asks questions. Well, why does God have to ask questions? God knows everything. God shouldn't have to ask questions at all. Okay, but what we talked about the last Parashah was that God asks questions for our benefit, not for our own. When it says God remembered, God doesn't remember as I forgot something. Well, He's God. God doesn't forget anything. Okay, so what happened was He took notice of all those in the ark in relation to the time that it now perfectly passed. In other words, what I'm saying here is that it was now time. God noticed that perfect amount of time had passed, and He took notice of them and said, okay, now it's time to go ahead and start bringing the waters down to go ahead and start over again. Okay, so again, God did not remember as in, oh man, I forgot something. No, that's not what God did. God took notice that the perfect amount of time had passed, and now it was time to allow the waters to go down so that all those aboard the ark could start living their lives again and starting over. All right. So the same wind, if you notice, there's a kind of a correlation here. It talks about wind blew over top of the land to go ahead and cause the waters to recede. Now that recession had not started until that wind started to blow. Okay? If you go back to the creation narrative, there was also a wind that brooded over all of creation. That wind was there in an active state. It was the Spirit of God in an active state waiting to do something, to create. Okay? At the Word. So if the Father, in the Godhead Adonai, the Father gave um, created in his mind. The Word actually was sent forth, and the Spirit actually created what was going on. So all of God was involved in creation. And here again, all of God is involved in the recession of the water so that creation can start over again. Okay? All right, so just as the waters stayed where they were at for 150 days, the waters then receded for 150 days. Okay? Finally, at the end of those 150 days, the ark rested high up in the mountains of Ararat. Now, that's probably a pretty familiar name to you, along with the ark. There have been a number of archaeological surveys and expeditions and sightings over the decades and centuries, but of but really no one knows where the mountains of Ararat are. Today they're considered to be in way far eastern Turkey and almost to the border of Turkey and to the east and just south of the border of Armenia. But again, no one really knows for sure just where it's at. We also don't know. We also have no proof of the ark being found at all. Now there are supposed sightings and there's supposed photographs and things, but none of that's been actually definitively proven. Excuse me. Oh, did she really? Yeah, I got it on video. So she came over and knocked on the door and wanted to exchange information. She had run to Walmart. I was up in the middle of watching them. So I'm so sorry. That's okay. This is my information. You can take it down or give it to her or whatever, but have her text me and give me her information. Okay. Or I could come back out here. I live on the north side of Oklahoma City, so it's just a long drive. Oh, okay. I'm so sorry about that. So yeah, if you can just let her know, and then maybe we can just figure out how to take care of it. I think maybe get your okay. It did it for you. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, excuse me about that. I had to take care of something. Again, we're not all perfect. Just had something happen and got to take care of it. So again, I'm human just like everybody else. My wife is too, and that's just how it is. So let's get back into this teaching because I want to finish out our teaching. So let's see here. All right, so again, there is no definitive proof of the ark being found or that Ararat is even where we think it is. Okay, the point of it is to know that the ark did rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters were where it had come down, and now God was in the process of rebooting everything, if you want to think of it that way, and so where people could actually go ahead and animals and all of creation be able to start over. All right. So at the end of the 40 days, after the preceding 150 days, Noah went out and Noah reached out into, opened the windows of the ark and went ahead and released three three attempts, or two birds with three attempts to go ahead and see if the waters are gone. So first it was a raven. Sent the raven out, and the raven came right back, and there was nowhere for it to actually rest. So Noah knew that the waters had not gone down enough yet for the raven to go ahead and actually land. Then he sent out a dove twice. The first time, the dove brought back a olive branch. Okay, and when that dove did, Noah knew that at least there were now trees above, and things were growing. Okay, and then the next time when Noah sent the dove out, the dove didn't return, and so the Noah knew that the waters were gone enough to where the dove felt safe enough to go and not return. Okay, now the whole entire flood event took over a year from the time the rain started and the fountains burst forth until the ground was absolutely dry. And so we asked, why so long? Well, the first part was the actual rain itself, to actually get the waters to the level it needed to be to actually wipe out the face of the earth. The second was to go ahead and let the water remain at a certain level to make sure that any plants, anything at all that may still have somehow survived were dead. That the ground was completely washed away. That everything was dead. Okay. Now, then you had the next phase where it took a while for those waters to recede. If you can imagine, they were high as 22.5 feet above the highest mountain. That took a long, long time to go down. Okay, and so the rest of the time, after the 150 days, they actually were over, at the highest peak. It took the rest of that over a year period for it to actually reduce far enough down to where the rest of creation could actually live and plants could be planted without them rotting away. Okay, not only that, but it also hints at that along the way, when the flood waters gotten low enough, you started seeing vegetation appear again in various places. So as the water went down and down and down, you had different levels of elevation that started getting plant life recovering. Okay, and so until it was down all the way as low as it was going to go, and the ground was dry, Noah and the rest of creation aboard that ark did not come out. All right. So some thoughts about the flood narrative. So as you'll see in the rest of the Tanakh and the Parashah, you'll see that the flood narrative and other narratives throughout the Tanakh are repeated, where they're actually mentioned and they're used. There are midrashes, or there are studies made of them. There are comparatives made of them to illustrate greater truths. Okay, so I got to thinking about the week of time that Noach and his family had to prepare to actually go into the ark. And it reminded me of the week, or the time period between the 69th and the 70th week. So if you read the end of the 69th week, through the 62nd week and 7 weeks, it talks about the Messiah coming, Messiah being cut off. And then there's a period between then the 70th week, and that is where the 70th week is actually the week of tribulation. It's the week of the of Jacob's troubles. Okay, and so between that time, there had to be something going on. And so I believe that it was after that time, after Messiah had done his work and been cut off, and that God had his people doing work, preparing for that 70th week, just like Noach was preparing for the flood to come. He has us during this week of this time, between the 69th and 70th week, preparing for that 70th week. And so now, again, just to kind of point out, Noach was not taken out of the away from the earth. He was not taken to heaven. He was not raptured, so to speak. He was there on earth, but he was kept protected from what was happening to the earth. If you think about what happened during the plagues in Egypt, okay, when Israel was getting ready to come out, the same thing. God protected Israel from it, but he did not take them out of it. And it's going to be the same thing in the tribulation period. We are not going to be taken out of it. We are not going to be given special treatment as opposed to the rest of the people of God to be taken out of tribulation. We will be protected from it, just like God protected Noach and his family and creation, and just like God protected Israel. Okay. If you remember also, Yeshua or Jesus talked about that is as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the end. Okay, so everyone was doing their own thing. They were married and giving away in marriage. They were just living normal life, and all of a sudden the end came upon them swiftly. Okay, kind of the way, same way they happened here in the flood, where they were doing their thing. Wicked as it was, they were doing their thing, not paying attention, doing whatever. Probably making fun of Noah as he built the ark, just as most people nowadays make fun of believers who believe in the end, in the second coming of Yeshua, and that the tribulation is coming. Just like we are made fun of that way. I'm sure that Noah was being made fun of for building the ark until the day the flood came. Then all of a sudden it was a completely different story. Okay. All right. So eventually God commanded Noah and his family and all the creatures to come out. Now notice he did not, even though he had the roof of the ark open, even though he knew the ground was dry, even though he could have left, he waited for God's explicit command for them to leave. And he did not leave until that command was given. Okay? Again, Noah was very, very, very cognizant of only doing things based on God's command. Okay? So as they came out, after that, Noach went ahead and offered every clean animal as a sacrifice to God in worship and thanks. So he worshiped God, gave a sacrifice to God in worship and thanks for their salvation, for redemption, for keeping them safe from the flood. Okay? Again, we're seeing the first explicit mention, not first, but maybe first explicit expression of sacrifice, but it's hinted at also back in the creation narrative, or I'm sorry, the Adam and Eve narrative, when they are given skins to cover up with. Okay, now God thought it smelled, I spelled that wrong, sorry about that. God thought it smelled good for a couple of reasons. Okay, now we think about well, why would God care if, we went ahead and killed an animal and burned them up to him? Okay, why would that even matter? What would that do for God, right? Um, so it was an act of worship that pleased him. Okay, so anytime we do an act of worship to him, it pleases him, as long, obviously, as it's done within the bounds of his expectations. But honestly, if you're going to worship him, you're going to do so in the bounds of his expectations. Doesn't make any sense that you would actually do outside of that knowingly. So again, that act of worship pleased him. That's one reason why it smelled good. The other reason that I was reminded of by the Spirit is it reminded him of his ultimate plan of salvation of the earth through Yeshua's final sacrifice. So, and it wasn't just here. Every time one of God's people offered a sacrifice to him, it was the worship, yes, but it was also, it reminded God every single time that the final sacrifice was coming and that everything will be set right from that starting point. Now, does that mean it'll be like fleshed out at that point? No, there's still points we had to go through until Yeshua returns and actually formally sets it right. But that act of sacrifice was the catalyst. It was how people would be redeemed and saved. And through sacrifices, although also an act of worship, they were also a teaching device, especially with Israel after the Torah was given. It was especially a teaching object lesson to teach them of what sin costs and what would have to be done to remediate that situation. And then, of course, we know that animals are not perfect, they're imperfect. You cannot cancel out imperfection with imperfection. It would take Yeshua's sacrifice of his perfect self to cancel out imperfection. And that is the reason for the first coming of Messiah Yeshua, was to deal with the issue of sin. The second coming will deal with judgment and the establishment of his earthly kingdom. Okay, so moving on, God would never again curse the ground because of man. Okay, as long as the present age or Olam Haba exists, okay, everything will always proceed like it has. You'll have harvest time and planting time. You'll have summer and winter. You'll have all these things will continually exist all the way to the end of this age. Okay. And so throughout this age, God will not cause a flood or not do anything of that nature, curse the ground or anything again through the rest of this age. Now, eventually, God will go ahead and flood the earth again through fire when he purges the earth with fire, and a new heavens and new earth are brought to us. Okay? God did this even knowing that humankind is still prone to evil inclination, okay, or what's known in Hebrew as a Yetzer Hara, okay. The Yetzer Hara is the evil inclination. It is present in each of us. We have an inclination to do good, and we have an inclination to do evil. And even with us having that evil inclination, knowing that evil inclination will grow and get worse over time, God still went ahead and promised not to curse the ground again. Okay? All right. So why would God not do it again? Okay? He accomplished what he set out to do, to start all creation on land over again. That was the purpose of the flood. The purpose of the flood was to reboot creation, at least on land. Okay? It was also to wipe out the angel-human hybrids. Okay, now remember, the sons of God or the angels came down to go ahead and take wives themselves. So abandoning their former home, coming down to take imperfect humans, wives, and to go ahead and basically have children with them. And so these angel-human hybrids were born that were superhuman. If you remember back in the first Parashah we talked about, were superhuman and had a great propensity to follow their evil inclination. And so they had really accelerated the evil of humanity and had totally disrupted God's order as part of that all flesh corrupting their way. All right. And so again, part of that was also to wipe them out to where they were no longer an issue. Okay, so just like in the creation narrative, humankind is once again commanded to be fruitful and multiply. So God has always wanted there to be a lot of us. Okay, now initially, God did not tell Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. And the reason why was because they had to go through this time of testing, which happened with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or what I talked about being the knowledge of disobedience and sinfulness. Okay. But God always wanted there to be a lot of humanity. He wanted to interact with all of us. He wanted to have us as to have a relationship with. And this is even despite our corruption now, that God still wants that relationship. Okay, so you'll notice here that now God gives mankind permission to go ahead and to kill and eat of any of the creatures upon the ground, in addition to the plants. Okay, this changes the dynamic between humankind and creatures, because now creatures develop a fear of humankind. Okay, not only that, but I fully believe that also there was a change dynamic between creature and creature also. Okay, um, creatures may have been killing each other prior to the flood because all flesh had corrupted its way. But I definitely believe now that creatures were definitely preying upon each other. And then you also have man preying upon creatures. Okay, so God created this fear, and it was there to keep animals and humans kind of separate, to where the corruption of the earth wouldn't happen as fast as it did before the flood. So, and you're going to see again later when we talk about the Tower of Babel, that God is putting in place measures to try to stem the corruption of the earth from happening as fast and as intense as it did before the flood. All right, so God also says here that whoever, person or creature, that sheds human blood will have their blood shed by a human. Okay, now God does judge himself, but if you look in the Torah, whenever somebody had done something worthy of the death penalty, they were put to death by another human, exactly as it says here. So why? Why does God command this? And the reason why is because we are made in his image. Okay, we are the pinnacle of creation. We are made in his image. We are the apple of his eye. And so whenever a person or a creature kills a human being, it is like assailing God's image. And he does not take that lightly. All right, so not only was humanity commanded to multiply, but he was also commanded to become great as well. In other words, God wants us, he didn't want us to go out and just have children and multiply upon the face of the earth. He also wanted us to become great and live our best lives. And that's still what he wants for us today, to live our best lives. Not just to go through the motions, not just to live, not just to multiply, but to live our best lives. Okay? And of course, our best lives are lived when we follow his commandments. Now you see the covenant that is made with God and all of creation. So, if you notice, Noah offered sacrifices to God. There was blood shed, okay? And that is when God made the covenant with Noach and all of humanity and all of creation. And in that covenant, God promised to never flood the earth again. And he gave the rainbow as a sign that whenever it's storming really bad outside or raining really hard, that when that rainbow appears, it serves as a reminder to humanity that God's promise remains, and also it also it also seen by God in the way his justice sees that and remembers the covenant he made not to do that. There is judgment coming, and that justice side of God will be satisfied, but not through a flood. All right, so now we're looking at the dispersion of Noach's family. This is in chapter 9:18 to chapter 10, verse 32. So it says here, Noach is the first person to plant a vineyard, which means that no one prior to this had ever planted a vineyard. It also kind of speaks to the fact that he was the first to actually create wine, to drink of the fruit. And so if Noah had no idea about what would happen if he drank of of old fermented fruit, Now, let me go back a minute for that. So it very well could be that prior to this, no one planted vineyards. They were just there, and then people just grabbed grapes and whatever, and that's how it was. But it says that he was the first person to plant vineyards, and so I'm taking it at face value, the pashat of the text, which means the um the actual text itself, without any kind of reading into it. And so he was the first one that that planted vineyards, and he also drank of the fruit of it. It must have become fermented. It must have become fermented, um, and so he got drunk off of it. Now, if Noach really was the first one to plant vineyards, he would have had no idea that drinking the juice from there, maybe when he planted the vineyards and he got the juice, he let it sit out for a long time. They didn't have refrigeration back then, right? So it would eventually started fermenting, and then he would have gotten drunk off of it. Okay. Well, if that never happened before, then he would have no idea what would happen if he got drunk. And so he started doing things he was completely unaware of because he was under the influence of the alcohol that had been produced in the fermentation process with with those grapes, or that grape juice. Okay, so during that period, Noach was not covered up for whatever reason. He was naked. Okay, and so he's in his tent, thinking that, hey, I'm in my own tent. No one's really going to see me. And maybe he was thinking that. I mean, I don't know how drunk he was. But Ham, his son, comes in and starts staring. Now, it makes it very explicit in the Hebrew in the text that he was staring point blank at Noach's private parts. Okay, now we may get the image in mind where he caught a glimpse and then went back outside and told his brothers. But it makes a point of saying he stared. He actually intently stared at them. Okay? And this gives you kind of an inkling of the depravity to come from Ham's family. Okay? Now, the other two sons, they did what was right. Okay? And it hints, because Japheth will live in the tent of Shem, it hints that Shem was the one who actually came up with the idea to do what was right and cover up their father. And Japheth agreed and went with him. Okay? Now, later on it talks about Canaan being cursed. Why not Ham? Or Ham was the one who actually went and actually stared at his father's private parts. Why did it not say Ham was cursed instead of Canaan being cursed? Well, if you think about how things progress, so Ham may have stared and he shouldn't have. Okay. However, if Ham went out to live on his own, like his brothers did, and they established their own parts of the earth, he would have taught his children the things that he was doing. Or at least the children would have picked up on it by watching. Okay, and so that behavior pattern would have been passed down to his children, and eventually, if you remember in the Tanakh and why in the Torah, why God wanted to remove the descendants of Canaan from the land was because of their behavior, because of the awful, atrocious, malignant things they were doing in the land that had caused the land to want to vomit them out. Okay, and so Canaan was cursed because of what would happen later. Okay, of what those children were turned into based on what had started to happen with Ham and his interaction with Noach in the tent. Okay, and there's probably more to that, that cursing and things, but that I see a definite starting point here where there was a definite start of depravity at that moment when Ham was in Noach's tent, explicitly staring at Noach like he shouldn't have been. Okay? Notice also that when Ham went outside told his brothers, he didn't tell his brothers, "Hey, let's go cover him up." Ham didn't make any attempt to cover him up at all. So we have no idea what he runs and say, "Hey, come check it out. Dad's naked." Was he kind of like that? If it was, again, it's another act of depravity. Okay. All right, so now we start to talk about the descendants of Noach and their dispersal. And in the midst of that narrative, we see somebody named Nimrod. Okay, now, Nimrod is described as a mighty hunter. Okay, and when I first saw that, that instantly reminded me of Esau, who was also the same. And it came to mind that these two men also shared the same behavior patterns. They were very animal-like. They were very aggressive. They were very debased in their thinking. Okay, and so if you have that picture, if you can kind of place that kind of picture we have of Esau as a mighty hunter onto Nimrod, we kind of start seeing a picture of what's going on here in the incident of Babel or Babel. Okay, now Nimrod was over an empire that included Babel or Babel and Nineveh. Okay, and those in all for all intents and purposes, that was the world at the time. So Nimrod was in effect king over the entire world. Okay, and he's also there during the during the time that the Tower of Babel was built. Okay, and we'll get into more of that here in just a minute or two. All right. Also, coming out of this genealogy of the dispersal of Noach's family, also is the listing of the 70 nations of the world. This is where this 70 nations of the world comes from. It comes from that list. All right. Now, that 70 nations of the world is important because if you look at the Feast of Tabernacles, or if you look at Sukkot, in other words, in Hebrew, you'll notice that at the end there were sacrifices made. There were 70 animals offered, okay, in all, and those animals represented a sacrifice for each of the nations of the world. Okay, and so that 70 nations is very important in the theological sense. All right, so let's get into the Tower of Babel narrative. So, Tower of Babel narrative, this happened during Peleg's life. You'll see back earlier in Shem's genealogy, it talks about during Peleg's time that's when the lands were divided. Okay, and so it was during this time that the Tower of Babel was being built. Okay, so this building, now, if you first look at the scripture and you read through it, you're like, well, what was the problem? Why did God have a problem with them building this tower? I don't get it. What's the issue? The issue behind it was the intent. Okay, remember, God's always looking at the motive of the heart. It's not even so much the outward that you're seeing, it's the inward. God's not concerned about so much the outward. Now, there are outward consequences that come out of the heart, but that's why God looks at the heart. Okay, because you can actually mask the inward thinking or inward desires of your heart because of what you do outwardly. Okay, but God always sees it. Okay, and so God saw the intentions of why it was being built. Okay, and so as you can see there in the scripture, it says, so we can make a name for ourselves. In other words, we don't want to be forgotten. We want everybody to know we're important. And Nimrod most likely commissioned the project in the aspiration to be like God. Notice he was already king of the whole world. Okay, so this guy probably, if he was like Esau, he already had a depraved, aggressive mindset where it wouldn't be very stretched imagination for him to start wanting to aspire to be like God. And so he's probably the one that called them all together to go ahead and start on this project to build this tower. And the whole point was to make a name for themselves. Okay, and that's probably what Nimrod told them. We're going to make a name for ourselves. Let's build this tower. Okay, and the whole point was them to be like God. It was that, and like you received in parentheses there, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's been the same so far ever since the garden, that man is trying to be like God and trying to be independent of him. Okay, it's arrogance in the highest. And that is what's happening here with this tower. It's arrogance. Okay, so God saw that in their unity, the people would do anything. They could do anything. They could accomplish anything. Okay, and because of their propensity for evil, God had to put a stop to it. So God confused their languages to where they couldn't understand each other, and then through that, the peoples were all scattered to solidify the formation of those 70 nations. Okay? So again, the disruption of human unity made it much harder for humanity to commit evil on a mass scale again, at least not right away. Okay? And we're seeing that slowly reverse, where you're seeing more and more human unity over time, although it will never come to the point of total human unity. We have become more unified over time in general. Now, these are still wars everywhere, still nations fighting nations, still east versus west, north versus south. We still have all that going on, but in general, humanity has become more united than it ever has before. And you can start to see our scale of evil has increased more than any ever before. Okay, so looking at Shem's lineage is important. Okay, Shem's lineage is the lineage that God works with to bring deliverance. It is a lineage that God uses to bring about a salvation and the solution to the problem of sin and our separation from Him. Okay, and in that line, you see, of course, Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov. You see Moshe. You see Israel, all of Israel, and you see Messiah Yeshua. That is all part of Shem's lineage and all part of how God would work to bring deliverance and salvation to the world, which was God's entire purpose from the very beginning. Okay, so Abram's family, including his brothers and his father, Terah, left Ur to go to Canaan. Now they're supposed to go all the way to Canaan, but for some reason they end up stopping and just stopped in Haran, which is located just north of the Syria border in present in Turkey. Okay, so that's kind of where it's located right now. But they stopped there. They stopped there to excuse me, my wife came in. They stopped there for whatever reason. I don't know if somebody got sick. Maybe they can no longer continue. Maybe Terah gotten so old he couldn't continue anymore. We don't know. We don't know. We don't know why they stopped. Okay, but they did. Okay, and so at the very last part of this, we read about this Parashah that Terah only lived a fraction of the lifespan of those before the flood. So before the flood, they lived at 2 to 3 times the lifespan of Terah. Now we see that he's only living a fraction of that. Now he's still living longer than we do, but you see that lifespan is gradually decreasing, and we're eventually going to get down to that 120 years that was talked about earlier. Okay. All right, so that is the end of our Parashah portion. I hope it blessed you. I hope you learned a lot. I encourage you to continue to study and read up for yourselves. Prayer is not for just private interpretation, but everybody is free to go ahead and learn themselves and also learn from each other. I include this in my Parashah portion now. If you need prayer, want prayer for anything at all, please go ahead and send your prayer request to that email address there. Please keep it anonymous. I don't need to know everything. I don't need to know your last names. I don't need to know any of that things. All I really need is your first names. Let me know your first name or the first name of somebody you want me to pray for. If it's not about you, give me the first name of those you want me to pray for, and I will definitely pray for them. Okay. All right. Well, that is again the end of this Parashah teaching. Um, I hope again, I hope you were blessed by it and learned a lot. Please enjoy the rest of your Shabbat. And barachot to you, blessings, and I will see you next time. Shalom.